department that were kind of the organizers of it. They sort of initiated it. That's Neo, Trevor, and Adi, and I don't see any of them here today, but they were sort of the life force behind getting us organized for the working group in the fall. So I just wrote some notes. I didn't create a formal presentation, so I'm just going to pull those up now and make sure I stay on topic. So I guess I'll start with the overall structure of how our group worked and why we structured it that way, and then talk a little bit about what insights we kind of gleaned from the group, or the sort of main things that we ended up talking about a lot during the semester. So the students had approached us about having this working group structured around qualitative methods, unsurprisingly, given the Institute's mission. But specifically, they were interested in interviews and archival methods. And so Tom and I were sort of thinking about how we want to structure this and what the goal here really is. And as this is my first year teaching at Cornell, so I wanted to also have the chance to sort of meet more students in the department, which is something that's really been hard as a first year faculty member teaching during a pandemic. So we thought of breaking it up into two different types of sessions. So we had, we wanted to talk about non-elite interviews, elite interviews, and then archival methods. And then we wanted to have general discussions, which we could invite all of the government students to, the Gov department students to those sessions. And then we wanted to have more focused sessions where we got to workshop the projects and the ideas around these methods that those three specific grad students brought to us. So what we ended up doing is we ended up having 7 sessions throughout the semester. So 3 sessions that were these general discussions where we invited all of the students from the government department to participate, and we had a sort of syllabus that we constructed, so certain readings that we wanted to do and discuss for each of those. And those were sort of meant to be general introductions and discussions of, as I said, non-elite interviews, 1 week interview, elite interviews, and then archival methods. And then, the other 4 sessions were structured around the 3 graduate students' projects. So what we had them do is take each of those methodological approaches and develop in some ways a sort of first draft of a research proposal using those methods that would work for one of their projects. So for non-elite interviews, thinking about, who would these non-elite people be? So what is the potential sample, and what kind of questions, are they going to be able to answer? Similarly, for elite interviews, what is the potential sampling frame, and what kind of questions would you be interested in asking them? And then finally, for archival methods, what are the types of archives that exist that might be relevant for your topic, and what kind of queries can you make of those archives? And also, issues around access in terms of interviews and archives. So that was the overall, I guess the final session was sort of a reflection on the semester and a chance to sort of revise any one of those proposals in the sort of second draft, like what would be, what's the next step in trying to push one of those projects forward. So so that's the overall structure that we adopted for the semester. I think it was really productive. For me, it was a great chance, like I said, to meet some additional graduate students, and in particular to get to know the 3 graduate students who had approached us about the working group. And it was also, I think, really productive for the graduate students to get kind of focused feedback on their projects, on these potential projects. These are, I think, almost all of them are second year, finishing up their second year. And so they're getting ready to work on their their dissertation proposals or prospectuses. So I think that was really productive in that sense. So then moving on to the second set of comments, just thinking about what kind of insights we generated as a group. So I think the big thing, Tom and I both have done field work and worked with each of these types of methods. And so a big thing that we emphasize from our own experience is the amount of learning that happens on the ground. So, it's really important that you prepare for each meeting, you know who you're going to meet, you practice asking questions, you think about follow-up questions, you try to imagine what the interview might be like, what the structure of the interview should be and how that could work. You think about your sampling frame for your interviewees, but it just seems, broadly true from both of our experiences, but also from the experiences of other colleagues, that these things always evolve when you're on the ground, when you're in the field, as you go through interviews. So after you've interviewed 5 people, you start to see maybe a common theme, and you sort of think about more specific questions you can ask if you want to pursue that, or you sort of transition away from that set of questions. But also in the middle of an interview, things can evolve. Somebody can say something quite surprising in response to you, and you have to think about how you're going to, develop follow-up questions to that. So I think a lot of it is just emphasizing that there's a lot of learning that happens on the ground. And you can prepare, the more you prepare, the better you'll be able to handle these surprises, but also just to be open to that. I think Tom said it in an email. I asked him kind of about what insights we wanted to emphasize. And he said, this idea that serendipity is playing a huge role in fieldwork. Sometimes you meet somebody and they're able to open the door to a bunch of other data, a bunch of other people that you want to interview. And then there are times when you just have to put your head down and kind of keep going, because it gets really hard and you don't have that serendipitous moment for a while. You have these sort of breakthroughs that happen. It doesn't always feel like a linear development. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize is, despite the role of serendipity and the learning that happens on the ground, another big thing we talked about is the importance of organization. So in doing a lot of this field work, you often don't feel organized about the overall project or even the question you're working on. You're like kind of sometimes still churning about what it is you're really researching. But keeping the small pieces of your work well organized is really fundamental to being able to I think, talk about your qualitative methodological research in a really helpful and clear way, I guess, after the project. So, being able to talk about the interviews that you pursued that didn't work out, being able to talk about the interviews you ended up having, why you selected those people, all of that's going to help for when you're just writing up the thing, you're thinking about your citations for all of that work that you did. The more organization you can bring to these small pieces of your research, the better. So this just includes a ton of spreadsheets. Spreadsheets of archival boxes that you've worked in. I emphasize the importance of photos of archival boxes, where you sort of structure your photographs around certain boxes so you remember where things came from, and then spreadsheets of interviews, and just keeping that really up to date as you're going through your field work. And then, of course, saving it all on a cloud so that you don't have any issues with access later on. So I think that's another important thing that we talked a lot about in each of our sessions. And then, another thing we talked about a lot, especially in the context, I think this is true of archival methods, but it can feel really true in your interviews, is thinking really carefully about how you can ask answerable questions. So there can be these really big questions where, you can really spin your wheels on them, but when you're in your interviews or when you're thinking about developing your research project, it's important to ask things that can be sort of answerable by your interviewees, or trying to structure how you're doing your research around things pieces you can really actually make progress on. And that can be really, really important in structuring your fieldwork and structuring your research design. And so that was another piece that we talked a lot about. Not sort of just asking people generally about, you can ask them generally, but you kind of have to slowly zero in on pieces of what they can give you, on pieces where they can answer the question and not just give you the most vague answer. And this can be true in an archive too. So really having an idea of what is it, what would be evidence against your hypotheses, what would be supportive of your hypotheses, and trying to be really specific about that ex ante can really help push the research forward. So those are our sort of 3 big themes in terms of the insights. And I want to just end there. I think I've spoken long enough. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was fantastic. Yeah, so I took lots of notes. So I know we'll have time at the end for questions. So thank you. And to your whole group for all of their work this semester or this year. I really appreciate it, and for you for sharing it. So next up is Alex Nading and Jamie Luria from Anthropology and Shirley Le Pen from Government.
Hi, I can get us started. I will just briefly present the overview of our group and what the goal is. So my name is Shirley. I'm a second-year PhD student in political theory in the Department of Government. And my research has to do with continental political thought and experiences of confinement. So last semester, I've had the pleasure to take a class with Professor Nading, and I think I can speak here for Jamie and Itamar too, from our group. And this class was on ethnographic methods. And this was really an eye-opening class for me because in this class, we talked about the numerous ways one can do or practice ethnography, but also we talked about the numerous ways one can understand when an ethnographic site is made of and makes or produces in return. And by the end of the semester, we decided to take our interest for ethnographic methods a step further, and with the generous help from the QuIRI Center, we started to inquire basically what does it mean to do ethnography in a context of pandemic, what does a practice of ethnography entail in this context, and what are the merits and the flaws of ethnographic methods in times of crisis more generally. So in this group, our goal has been to approach and rethink what ethnographic field means, and kind of like to put into question the materiality that is usually attached to the field. And we were trying to explore the possibility of a new normal. What does it mean to create to produce ethnography in a new normal context. And so basically it's about trading the traditional face-to-face encounter, or this idea of like entering the field, or producing face-to-face interviews with other alternatives. And so I will briefly talk about the 4 distinct alternative areas we are interested in. So first, digital media. So digital media has to do with the collection and use of data from diverse social media platforms. And basically it's about thinking of these platforms as ethnographic sites. And so basically it brings a question of how are we to consider the scope of our fieldwork in light of these multimedia that we can use, and how the plurality of modes of media influence and shape the way we conceive of the field as such, and of the way we conceive and envision field work. The second area has to do with experimental ethnography. So we use this term capaciously to include visual media, multimedia production, and the translation of ethnography into visuals, and vice versa, such as photography, filming, documentary. And so through this idea of experimental ethnography, we think of ethnography as a collaborative space and project that does not exclusively belong to the researcher. Third, we are interested in this reading group by the idea of situated knowledge. And this has to do with the question of the power to define. This is actually a term that has been used by one of the scholars that we had the pleasure to read and meet in the context of this reading group. His name is John Jackson. So the question is, who has the power to define? what the field is and means, where does the field start, where does it end, who is part of the field, and who gets to decide basically who is part of the field. And asking these questions allows us to delve into the complexity of other questions which pertain to positionality, temporality, exclusion, silence, refusal, memory, abolition, among other themes. And finally, one other alternative that we are interested in this reading group has to do with the archive and the way we conceive of the archive. So we take the archive to be both an object of inquiry and also a resource for inquiry. And yes, it's about thinking about how the archive has changed in times of COVID. The use that we make of it also has changed, and how it brings new questions around ethics and interpretation. So that's hopefully brief overview of what we're doing in this reading group. So I pass it to Jamie.
Thanks, Shirley. And thank you to QuIRI for the opportunity to speak a bit about our group's work together. My name is Jamie Luria. I'm a rising third-year PhD in anthropology, researching heritage landscapes and historic preservation projects in Catalonia and Israel-Palestine. My research engages a mix of ethnographic and historical methodologies. And with the generous mentorship of Professor Alex Nading from anthropology, we've formed an interdisciplinary cohort, really, as Shirley said, with the intention of continuing our work together from this fall 2020 course on ethnographic field methods taught by Alex. And every 3 or so weeks since January, we've met to discuss texts that span anthropological and specifically ethnographic literature, as well as social and political theory and critique. And we've invited multiple scholar practitioners to join our group, including John Jackson Jr., who joined us on Zoom from the University of Pennsylvania a few weeks ago, Elizabeth Povinelli of Columbia University, who will be meeting in June, and Yael Navarro of Cambridge, who we're hosting in July. And our intention is really to bring scholars whose work has had an impact on us for reading their books together into conversation around experimental ethnography and ethnographic subjectivities, among other things, and to really collaboratively glean insights from their theoretical and also methodological approaches to ethnographic practice, both inside and outside of the field. Lots of air quotes there. So we read Vicky Kirby's Quantum Anthropology's Life at Large, which is like a really deeply theoretical engagement with the limits of language and text in translation and representation of sort of the experience of the subject and also and the object of ethnography, and also sort of questioning the boundaries between knowledge as science and as a social project, or sort of a cultural, she says, cultural and social inheritance. Then we read Catherine Mariner's Contingent Kinship, The Flows and Futures of Adoption in the United States, which discusses a lot of relevant themes like the visibility of the ethnographer, what ethnography means in the absence of collocutors. And actually, Dr. Mariner came to speak as a speaker at the Anthro Colloquium, I think held maybe in February. So that was exciting. And Hugh Raffles also wrote a book called The Book of Unconformities, Speculations on Lost Time, which we read together. And John Jackson Jr.'s Real Black, Adventures in Racial Sincerity, which is a lot about being in the field, positionality, identity, performativity, and sort of the blurring of those lines. And so while our bibliography, I think, represents a really wide range of themes across anthropological discourse, we've really prioritized an engagement with issues of documentation, ethics, translation, and interpretation in the context of the global pandemic, and also in landscapes of social and political precarity, and what that will mean for our own fieldwork. So I'll turn it over to Alex. Thank you.
Great. Well, that Jamie and Shirley have covered a great deal of the territory that we're working through, and I want to echo their thanks to QuIRI for supporting this experimental working group. It's been really the highlight of my semester, and I'm really glad to say that it's going to continue over the next few months. And I think as our work continues to develop, I think there's a few things that I think I'm really looking forward to adding into the mix. And as we move into the summer and fall, I think we're going to be thinking, continuing to think about what an archive is and what kinds of ways in which ethnography finds itself kind of interacting with the archive's that sort of materialize before us, sometimes found archives are as interesting as sort of the intentionally sought archives. And so one way we're going to do that is by looking at something that's not anthropological. A.L. Weissman's work on forensic architecture and sort of using multidisciplinary models to think through crisis and war. And then we're going to turn to a multi-field anthropological work by Jason DeLeon, The Land of Open Graves. And we hope to have DeLeon join us. DeLeon works across biological anthropology, archaeology, forensic anthropology, and cultural anthropology to study life and death on the US-Mexico border, specifically in the Sonoran Desert, and precisely what happens to bodies and landscapes in the context of a militarized border policy in which the environment becomes a weapon. And then in the fall, we're going to think with one of our own colleagues, Professor Natasha Raheja, about multimodal anthropology. Natasha is a filmmaker as well as an ethnographer, and we're going to think with her about her forthcoming book, I think, and work that brings together film and traditional ethnography to think about borderlands and issues of security, which are, of course, of huge concerns in pandemic times. And finally, we'll have engagement with the work of Lisa Stevenson, an anthropologist from McGill University, who's done incredible work on the logics and politics of care in the Canadian Arctic, but is also now doing experimental work that involves thinking through memory around violence and post-conflict situations in the Andes, in addition to the work that she's been doing in the Canadian Arctic. So we're going to think about the ways in which drama and performance and other kinds of creative collaborations can generate new forms of ethnographic knowledge. And I think the whole point of this, as Shirley and Jamie both put it, is to think about ethnography not just as data collection, but as generative experiment. And so all of the themes that we work with, materiality and situated knowledges, and the meaning of archive, and of course, the sort of spatial explosion or disparateness of what counts as a field, all sort of obtain in this sort of experimental moment. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be an anthropologist or an ethnographer more broadly, and so it's been really, really fun to think in this way. And so I think I'll leave it there, and really looking forward to hearing what the other groups are up to.
Awesome. It was so lovely to hear from so many of your team members. Thank you so much. It was, yeah, again, lots of really interesting questions and sparks of ideas, and it's really great, again, to think about how the pandemic is impacting how we do what we do, and that there are some really, if something good can come of it to get us to think more creatively about the research process, then I think that can be really generative. So thank you very much. Next up, we have the working group, Tristan Ivory from ILR and Tali Goff from Africana Studies.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many different folks. And it seems like we'll continue a string of people doing kind of researchy things, but not necessarily the same sort of faculty groups or working groups. So it's really interesting to see the directions that everyone else has taken things in. So I'm here as one of the representatives from what we titled the CrossNational Issues in Racial and Ethnic Inequality working group. So we represent a variety of folks from across the spectrum of Cornell and people, faculty and postdoctoral fellows. So in addition to myself, as Lee pointed out, I'm an assistant professor of ILR in International Comparative Labor. We also have Chiara Gali, who is a Claremont postdoctoral fellow in sociology. And of course, as Lee had also mentioned, Tali Goff, who's an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies. And then Peter Rich, who's an assistant professor of policy analysis and management. And then Eleanor Painter, who's a postdoctoral associate through the Einaudi Center's Migration Initiative, which you've probably heard of before as well. And so the purpose of this group, I guess bringing it back to the pandemic, is that everyone in the group felt a need for building academic community, especially working through issues that we were all approaching at in not wholly similar, but with a similar sort of ethos that are talking about challenges, particularly about the movements of people and about the movements of marginalized people in one shape or form of another, although not necessarily all in the same national context or dealing with the same particular issues. And so because of that, we formed a group that was largely aimed at supporting writing and thinking through writing, especially when thinking about racial or ethnic identity or issues with representation or presentation as well. And so the structure of our group is that we have 9 sessions. So we've already met for 7 of them. We have 2 to finish out, one during the 4th week of May and then another during the 2nd week in June. And the idea was to alternate between having sessions where we purely write and then having sessions where each of the group members presents some of their work to be workshopped. And so that work, we tried to make the entry point very low in terms of low stakes. It could be anything from working through feedback that one has gotten on a manuscript to the introduction of a book manuscript to working through some edits for a journal manuscript. Any sort of writing is fine for being workshopped. And it's been very important that we've built some sort of community so that we can have open and honest discussions, which I think we actually have had quite a bit. It's been one of the things that we've all talked about. Really enjoying about this group is that it's been one of the groups that we've had where we felt this kind of very supportive sense of community in terms of helping each other to work through different issues that we were experiencing, whether substantive issues or just kind of more epistemological issues or just issues with kind of the state that we're actually in as junior scholars trying to go ahead and push research forward and get it to land. So it's been so good, in fact, that we'd like to continue the group going forward, simply because it's something that I think all of us have found very supportive in terms of kind of working through, again, some of these challenging processes of making sense of the world and how our research fits within it. As far as the money that QuIRI generously provided, we all had different aims for that, but mainly working on, I think a lot of it has something to do with translation. So particularly, I know that for Chiara and for Eleanor, there's a kind of a built-in language component. So in Eleanor's research, which actually looks at the Italian refugee system, especially as it pertains to sub-Saharan African, particularly men, so there's an Italian component. And then for Chiara, who's looking at unaccompanied minors who have crossed into the United States, there's a Spanish component. So there's some of that. I worked through some issues of race and ethnicity in Japan, so have a Japanese component. And I know for some of the other folks, even though there's not a language component, there's been a little bit of money for hiring an RA or for working on transcription cost and things of that nature. I'm going to stop speaking right now so I don't go over, and I'm going to pass it on to Tali Goff, who wanted to share some thoughts as well.
Thank you, Tristan, and thank you, Lee, and also to the other people who shared their collective experience. This feels like a kind of special moment to translate what the past 7 sessions have been like. You know, I just feel really lucky to that we were selected for this chance to really think seriously about qualitative research. I only knew Tristan before going into this, and I'm also really grateful for his invitation to apply, because it's honestly been an incredible space to think about collaboration, deep collaboration in the social sciences and humanities, and to really interrogate what interdisciplinarity means. So I was pleasantly surprised by how much work I was able to get done for myself. Because usually being an interdisciplinary scholar, you end up kind of working across disciplines and helping others, being accountable to others, but not to one's own self. So I really feel like Tristan, Peter, Chiara, and Eleanor helped me to be accountable to myself in terms of we were sitting there every other week writing together. And at first it felt quite strange because I've never been in a writing group, but it soon helped me to understand the difference between a working group and a writing group. And I think the distinction is important. When I was in grad school at Yale, I was part of a working group on globalization and culture. In a lot of ways, we were covering similar themes in this group. But I feel the emphasis on each of us being junior was really welcome in a kind of camaraderie, even though we haven't all met, in order to think about, you know, the elephant in the room, the job market that has been really horrible for a long time now, right? And only gets worse in thinking about the pandemic. So it really felt like a support group to me in that we were sitting there, cameras on, mics off, just writing, and then sort of checking in with each other very quickly to share what our intentions were for the time so that we could be accountable to one another and give feedback where relevant. So the question of asymmetry felt really important, as well as thinking about time and the pandemic. I was able to complete a piece, which I promised to my group members I'm going to share today, even though I was supposed to turn it into all on Monday. And it's called Stolen Time, Stolen Life. And I came to that conclusion about time being important in a meta sense from learning from each of you about what it meant to give myself back that time and to have this generous funding in order to spur just doing one's own work. So I'm just really grateful again for the opportunity and to learn about fields that I didn't have a clue about, especially in terms of the social sciences. So yeah, thanks to all. It sounds like you're having equally stimulating experiences across the groups and bringing in external folks, which I think is a really wonderful idea as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing about your group and how it worked. It's so lovely to see different kinds of working groups and writing groups and to hear about the varied experiences, because this is exactly what we wanted it to be, you know, to write together, because it is so hard to prioritize your own work, particularly during a pandemic and with students and teaching and all of that stuff. So I'm so pleased to hear. And of course, it just warms my heart to think that these groups might continue on after. That is just really lovely. Okay, so thank you. Oh, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so one more thing. So actually, because of how this works so well as a cross between postdocs and assistant professors, I am co-leading a summer institute with Shannon Gleason this summer, and the deadline is today. So if folks want to apply, they really should, because the reason that I decided to have it be open to advanced grad students, postdocs, and assistant professors is based on this working group, this writing group, and how great it was to have that range so that we could all support one another. So I'm just going to put a link in the.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's awesome. That is awesome. All right. Next up is Una Jo from government.
Yeah, I actually prepared some slides. I'm going to put them up. I don't know if everybody can see them. Yeah, that's great. So it's really wonderful to be here and have this opportunity to share about our working group. Our working group was titled Studying Identities Through an Interdisciplinary Lens. So we are all graduate students. Rhea is from Nutritional Sciences, Elena is from Natural Resources Department, and Louis-Philippe, Joseph, and I are in the Government Department. Despite coming from all these different disciplines, we share a broad interest in identities and identity exploration. Now I have to share a caveat, which is that like the reflections that we decided to share today are less about the contents of our discussion and more about our experiences as graduate students organizing and participating in this working group. And we thought we'd share our experience this way because we come from very different backgrounds, and our aims for this working group was just a lot broader than the more focused discussions that we've heard about so far. So the purpose of our group was twofold. We had the first, which was thematic. We wanted to discuss how intersecting social identities shape political outcomes, whether they be in health equity, environmental education, or post-conflict narratives. And then the second was methodological. We wanted to explore how qualitative research approaches might help us study identities. We held 10 sessions in total, with the final discussion actually in person, which was very nice. And our working group consisted of two parts. So the first part was a reading group that was led by a member of the working group. And we read and discussed really broadly, given that many of us are just starting to delve into these methodologies. So the topics of our reading discussion were discourse analysis and process tracing to think about how we could ground our research historically, ethnography and participant observation to think specifically about fieldwork and how to immerse ourselves into the context of our research, interview and surveys to think about how we might capture contemporary manifestations of the identities that we're studying, creative and arts-based approaches to consider perhaps new and maybe more appropriate ways of engaging with our subjects, especially the vulnerable subjects, because some of us are studying children or post-conflict situations. And then lastly, qualitative research softwares to study their promises and pitfalls. So everyone made suggestions for the syllabus, and we very much read beyond our own disciplines. And then the second part of the working group was workshop. So each of us shared a piece of work in progress, whether it's an article draft or a grant proposal. And these were distributed a week in advance, and we came to the workshop prepared to give comments. So now here's some general insights from the working group, as well as some specific comments from the members of the group, which I collected in advance. And I prepared the slides because I wanted to just share their words with everyone. So in terms of what worked really well for us, we thought that the interdisciplinary approach of our working group was hugely beneficial. So here are some quotes from Rhea and Joseph. Rhea, who's in nutritional sciences, said being exposed to how the same methodology was being used in other fields helped her reflect on her own research. And Joseph likewise felt that engaging with other disciplines helped generate creativity and encourage reflection. So for instance, some of the readings that we drew from for our week on creative and arts-based methods were from refugee and media studies. And one of the readings suggested mapping of affective affinities to get to questions about identities, especially where so many cleavages intersect. And we very much enjoyed that. Another thing that worked really well was having a safe space for discussion. The reading discussions were led by a discussion leader, but as Elena mentions here, we were able to adjust our discussion quite freely depending on what we thought were important to discuss. And as LP says here, it also helped that our discussion often involved sharing about our own life and research experiences, which in my view really enriched our discussion, but also helped us become closer as a group. And finally, we all benefited greatly from the opportunities to share our work. I personally don't think that there are enough opportunities for grad students to workshop their projects with people from other disciplines. And this poses a huge barrier to students who want to produce interdisciplinary research. So in that sense, as Elena and LP say here, we really enjoyed discussing each other's work and learning from having to explain parts of our research that we might have otherwise taken for granted. So for instance, during Louis Philippe's workshopping week, he presented his ongoing research on populism in the Philippines, and it created a really lively discussion as Rhea, who is Filipino herself, added insights just based on her own life experience. And that was a very happy coincidence. So that said, there was one thing that we felt we could have prepared better or wished we had more resources to do so, and that was in crafting the syllabus. When we were first starting to organize the group, many of us had very little experience with each of these methodologies that we explored, SLP notes here. So the key challenge was in coming up with a set of readings that would provide broad-based understanding of the method, but also capture different uses of that methodology in other disciplines. I think we did okay in the end, but like as Joseph highlights here, I think it would be fantastic if QuIRI could catalog some of the working groups for future iterations so that other groups, maybe especially those organized by less experienced or graduate students, can draw from them. So the key lessons that we took away from organizing and participating in this working group are these. The first is that having a dedicated safe space to discuss qualitative methods and their application to different disciplines was really helpful, particularly because we're graduate students who are thinking about our own research designs. And second, sharing our work in progress with researchers from other disciplines really helps with double checking our assumptions and broadening the appeal of our research. This was especially helpful for those of us who shared grant proposal drafts, as these are often read by people who are not necessarily versed in the disciplinary lingo. And finally, one thing we will keep in mind for future working groups is that creating an effective syllabus is a really important first step, and making sure that the breadth and depth of the materials matches the objectives of the group also requires more thought and preparation than we initially thought. So that is all for our group. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was great. So I will say, just as a note, and I mentioned it to Una before she began, again, last year we weren't sure what the makeup of the working groups should be. We do currently have in place of the policy is that there should be a faculty leader or member at least to facilitate to some degree transfer of research funds, as you know, I think Alex's team has felt. But the other aspect of that is just has to do to some degree with having some experience to be able to bring so that you can help facilitate at least the organizational aspects of the working group. But I have to say, I was really impressed with how your team was able to really bring together a really nice structure and plan, albeit very ambitious for this semester. So I'll applaud. I certainly applaud you for that, and well done, certainly. So now is the time for questions, and I guess this is one of the questions that I have for all of the groups, and it has to do with how, perhaps a bit logistical, but how it is that you found each other. And because again, we're thinking about, you know, the next round and what we can do. I know I had said that I might be able to facilitate matching people, like if people wanted to join a working group, but they weren't sure what, and that's kind of where the grad student group fell. Only graduate students took me up on that. But I am interested in maybe Tristan in Tawi, hearing more about your group to find out how you found each other. I have a pretty good idea, Alex. It seems like your group really emerged from your class. But Alexandra, if you have other comments on that as well, it would be really helpful for us in our planning to hear how you found each other.
No, I can go. So, yeah, no, I think that it was sort of people that I knew, and then I was talking with Chiara, we were walking, and then I had mentioned that there was this opportunity. And then from that point, Chiara knew Eleanor, I had also known Tao from beforehand and Peter from beforehand. So it was probably more of a personal networks thing. But I think that I could have easily envisioned one group spawning off entirely from my department if possible. And so I think it's just finding probably someone who is very interested in sort of doing some of the initial work to pull some folks in. And I think seeding it that way in terms of finding folks that maybe have some area that they, or people that in mind that they want to work with, and then kind of pulling it in that way. I think you did that QuIRI coffee hour earlier, which I could imagine doing a few of those very early on could naturally lead people to figure out that they have research interest in common. So those would be my 2 cents for that.
That's a great idea. Erica, take note of that. We'll have to remember that coffee hour for next year. That's great. I don't know if Eleanor, yeah, please.
And yeah, then maybe we can hear from Eleanor or anyone else in the group, because I was thinking about a meal that Tristan and I had with some other folks, including Tamar Evangelestia Doherty, who's the Associate University Librarian at Cornell, at the Ethiopian restaurant near, I'm forgetting the name of it. But I think that the personal is important, as Tristan had just said, in terms of pre-pandemic people you've actually met in person and just being new in Ithaca and those kinds of bonds. So if it weren't for Tristan, I wouldn't have said yes, because there are like 6 other groups that I'm in and everyone wants to work with people who do interdisciplinary work. But yeah, I felt like it was important because I trusted Tristan and who he knew. So now I know Chiara and Eleanor and Peter, and I'm really glad for that. But I think it takes that in-person anchor to begin with, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. Alexandra? Yeah. Or I'm sorry, and then Eleanor, yeah.
Eleanor, do you want to go if you're part of the same group? Go ahead.
Oh, sure, thanks. I was just going to say something really quick following up from Tao, that one of the things that was really appealing about being in a group like this was actually, Tao mentioned being new. And I think as someone who, I know Chiara's also in the same situation, it sounds like some others are too, really just having moved here during the pandemic, this was such a really, it was an appealing opportunity to get to connect with an intellectual community, you know, when we're all on Zoom and it's really hard to meet people who aren't just in meetings with you. So I really appreciated that, and it made it attractive as something to join.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just echo what's already been said. I mean, it was a little bit different in the sense that I didn't know anyone when I arrived. So it wasn't based on, I mean, I had met Tom Popinski, who was the other faculty mentor, but I also didn't know him particularly well. I think the impetus for it was, you know, the challenge. There's always this challenge in providing, in teaching qualitative methods, at least in political science departments, I think, which is that the overwhelming emphasis within the discipline is on quantitative methods, you know, in this current moment. And it's really, it's, you know, I think qualitative methods are often more difficult to teach because there are components, I don't know, I mean, I really feel like there are components that can be practiced and can be taught, and then there are components that really revolve around personal experiences in the field. And there's a lot, you know, it's different than collecting survey data online or something like that, which I also do sometimes. So, you know, it just, I think that, so the impetus for it was really a recognition by students that there was, you know, they wanted additional training on how to talk to people in the field and how to access people and archives in the field. I mean, we have a lot of field methods courses, but there's maybe only one week where there's a discussion about that specifically. And so trying to break it out a little bit more than just interview methods as a 1 week thing, but say, okay, within interview methods, what are the additional components? Okay, so this is a long way of saying the students really were the impetus for it. They recognized, you know, a hole in their training and, you know, asked Tom to do it. And Tom reached out to me, knowing that I was new and looking for ways to connect with people, as, you know, Tristan and Towley and Eleanor have pointed out, you know, in the pandemic, you feel can be really isolating. And so I appreciate that. So it was partially these sort of personal networks and trying to build a community during this moment. And then also this sort of recognition of a gap in training. And so I think thinking about, you know, just reflecting on what worked, I think, you know, some of it should be driven by student needs or student requests or, you know, faculty requests. But it does seem like building community across disciplines is great. I mean, I love building community within government department, but I'm hearing all these people doing these interdisciplinary groups, and that sounds fantastic as well. So I think more of that would be great.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, and so this is to say that different working groups can take different options and structures and goals, and we pretty much funded everyone that applied last year, which says to me two things. One, we got really great applications, as we can hear from the work that came out today, but the other thing is that we can be doing more. So if you know people who you think might be interested, or if you know, please encourage them to apply. And then the other thing is that I would just remind all of you is that we do have a small research grant proposal process as well, which you are all eligible for, and just remind you that that's, you know, funding that you can apply for your research. Again, you can use them in different ways, right? And so I guess I would just encourage you to think about that as well. But I do really like, I mean, I think one of the themes that I'm hearing is, and again, we'll see what this looks like next year. Like, I could imagine there's also something really convenient about just getting on your computer and seeing people. Sometimes it's nice to get together, but sometimes there might be, I don't know, I think we're still going to be doing things on Zoom for a while. And so it'll be interesting to see where the working groups go next year. But I don't know, did anyone else have any other thoughts or anything else that they wanted to share about their experience? Okay, so, oh yeah, Peter, please.
Oh, I just wanted to add, we put the burden on Tristan and Tao mostly to represent our group, but Tristan invited me, and I'm actually primarily a quantitative researcher, but I work on similar themes, and so this became a really productive way for me to dig in. And so if there's room for going across methods as well, I would encourage some ways to think about that. I just wanted to put that out there, and I also just publicly wanted to really thank Tristan for organizing our group and bringing people together. So I'm excited that there's this kind of sort of push happening on campus and through CCSS.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really great point. And I think I saw that in your application, both, you know, with Tao's work as well as with your work, and thinking about the lines of what constitutes qualitative research, right? I think, you know, we don't specify who can apply. We just say, if you somehow self-identify somewhere in relation to social science, please apply. And so I will say on the working groups, in reading through some of these, there are, I think in the working groups, there's a lot of generative exchange that can be done across discipline, across method. And part of the goal of qualitative QuIRI is to also enhance multi-method approaches. So the workshop that we're running over the summer is actually primarily meant for more quantitative scholars who might be interested in thinking about how do research questions change when you have different methods, or do they change, and when and how. And so that's the goal of that. But I do think that we are really trying to, you know, none of these lines are clear, and I think at the intersections is where there's a lot of really fun and intellectually stimulating questions to be working together on. And so we see that both in the multidiscipline as well as the multi-method perspective. So thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate it. And maybe there's a way that we can make that more explicit in the call. We had mentioned multidisciplinary, but we didn't mention multi-method. So that might be a good addition to add. Thank you for that. Okay, well, thank you again for a wonder. I thoroughly enjoyed the last hour hearing having read through all of the proposals. To see how they came together in fruition is just such a wonderful and enriching experience for me. And I'm so thankful to you all for sharing. I've learned a lot. I have lots of notes. I might follow up on email with some questions because I'm interested in how the archive is really different from a data archive that open science is trying. So there's lots of interesting questions I think that this raised for me. So thank you again. Best of luck finishing up this semester, everyone. And I hope you are all able to take some time this summer to rest, to take care of yourselves, and to recuperate from a continued stressful world, so that we can all get back to being, to really engaging in our research with a little bit more energy afterwards. So thank you again. Take care, everyone.